All right, hello everyone. Right away, I want to thank you for coming back to my channel for another video. Today, we are talking about the second part of a previous video that I made, which had to do with public speaking. In case you didn't watch the first video on public speaking, and I guess I'm obligated at this point to say the link is in the description. The first part was about how to prepare to speak publicly. Basically, I suggested using writing as a tool to vividly imagine and experience an approaching public speaking event. And I'll say briefly that I think writing is the best way to prepare for most of the events that are going to take place in the future. Writing is a meditative exercise that allows us to vividly imagine, like I've said before, to vividly imagine the scenarios that we assign language to. But just because I think writing is the best way to prepare for some, upcoming series of events, that doesn't mean that I think it is without its potential downsides. And I mentioned this in the last video, but my goals remain the same. I want to help you as much as I can. I can't exactly speak to what your goals are. I can't speak to what the idea of actualizing your full potential looks like. All I can say is that I want to help you reach your goals. I've tried to provide a strategy for speaking in public. That's what the last video was for. This time around, I'm trying to tell you what to be careful of when you're preparing to speak publicly, and more generally, when you're thinking about, any high stakes and fast approaching future event. Okay, so first things first, what do we want to avoid when we try preparing for a public speaking event? What we want to avoid is laziness. We want to avoid sounding like we've practiced too much. And maybe that's a little paradoxical. You think, how can, my effort at practicing a lot translate to me sounding lazy or to some quality of laziness? So let's do a little bit of unpacking and we'll see if I can make the point. So I think a big risk we run when we use writing to prepare for a public speaking event, I think it has to do with memorization. I think most of the time we're trained to think of memorizing an idea as something that's good. And generally speaking, I think the ability to memorize is invaluable when we're in the K through 12 school system and even higher ed. And I'm also not saying that, memorizing isn't a useful skill, because it is, but inevitably there are downsides, and the downsides I think are worth addressing. And I made the point of memorization's benefit in an academic environment, but outside of an academic environment, an environment where our performance is, constantly and consistently based on testing, which rewards memorization rather than, say, applicability. At least oftentimes that's the case. Outside of this academic environment, memorization isn't that useful. And I don't think there's any arena that proves this point quite like the conversational arena. So public speaking, when I talk about public speaking, I'm talking about kind of an archetypal form of social presenting, whether it's in a professional environment or an academic environment or a social environment, makes no difference. You can rehearse answers to certain questions, whether you're preparing for a presentation in class or for a first date. But a major risk you run, again, has to do with memorization. The problem we expose ourselves to when we memorize an answer or even parts of an answer has to do with authenticity, which is something I think most people aren't taught to think about, especially when they talk. When we memorize potential answers to potential questions, we have to be completely honest about what we're doing. We are, yes, preparing to answer certain questions, but we're more so familiarizing ourselves with speech patterns pertaining to specific topics. And what that basically means is this: the answer we're formulating pertains almost exclusively to a preconceived idea that is, by its very nature, divorced from the event itself. And when I put it like that, I think we can begin to understand why it isn't necessarily a good thing, because, and this is maybe another thing young people, at least in my opinion, aren't often told to think about enough. Conversations are events that closely approximate musical compositions. The act of communicating with another person isn't something that's static or stagnant. In a way, it's alive. It's like a living being, because when you converse with another person, you're essentially wrestling to find some common ground where you can smoothly exchange ideas back and forth. And because it's alive, because it's a kind of balancing act, we can't expect answers that are memorized, or at least partially memorized, to necessarily land as though, we came across them spontaneously, as though they were, generated in the heat of the moment. And it's important that they come across as, at least relatively spontaneous, because that means they're uniquely tailored to the specifics of the conversation that you're engaging in. And I think that idea closely approximates the idea of conversation as music. What happens when we have a conversation with another person is this: we speak and they speak. And this is a kind of give and take. It's a literal dialogue between two people, but it's also much more than that if we kind of push it a little further. Thoughts and feelings are communicated both verbally and non-verbally. Then there's obviously the topic of conversation, what's literally being communicated with the words of the speakers. And when you factor things like personal history and intentionality and whatever other contextualizing information there is that exists between two people, I think we can start to see how things get a little musical, which is to say how smooth sailing, conversationally speaking, depends upon the proper attention being paid to a multitude of patterns as they manifest in real time. These patterns are overlaid. When they're working well together at the same time, a conversation feels harmonious and musical, which is to say that it's engaging and that it captures our attention. It's almost like we engage in a kind of creative flow state when we're in the midst of a good conversation. And I think when we try to memorize too much, when we try to prepare too much, the major risk we run when we go to speak publicly is that we do sound a little lazy. Conversing always involves a little bit of spontaneity. If you're going to be a good conversationalist, whether you're talking to someone you're romantically interested in, or talking to a friend, or giving a presentation in front of an audience, the ability to receive and give information is a superpower if you can master it. And if we rely too much on preconceived ideas, on answers we've prepared ahead of time, we run the risk of sounding like robots, like uninteresting robots. Good conversation, again, depends on our ability to improvise in a way that pertains directly to the conversation being had. And I think that's where it gets that musical quality that I'm talking about. That's where the act of conversing becomes something that closely approximates an art form. So if we don't want to memorize what we practiced beforehand, what's the point? What are we trying to do? In the last video I made about this subject, I talked about using writing to prepare, and I stand by that, but the way in which we use writing doesn't depend upon our ability to memorize. What we're trying to do when we write our way through a speech or a potential conversation or maybe a job interview, all we can hope for is familiarity with an array of information that's sufficient enough to help us. Obviously, when we think about giving a presentation in an academic environment, there's oftentimes, some rubric or some guidelines, some things we have to say, and I think that's kind of a little different than what I'm talking about. If you're required to memorize something, then by all means, go ahead and memorize it. The point that I'm trying to make is that memorization, while it can be useful for a particular set of public speaking events, most of the time is not so useful. We want to be able to respond and react to the events that unfold themselves before us in real time. So how do we do that if it's not just a matter of memorization? I think we do that by working through potential scenarios. There isn't any secret or cheat code. It's all about being able to dedicate ourselves. So, we're going for general knowledge, for familiarity, not memorization. And the difference between those two things, I think, is pretty significant. The simple act of writing through potential scenarios can help us improve our knowledge. And what that knowledge can translate to, if we prepare correctly, is the kind of conversation that is going to feel fluid and harmonious and musical. And, because of all of those qualities, it feels engaging. And again, it goes back to what I said before about feeling like you're caught in some creative flow state when you're in a conversation that's particularly great. Because when we familiarize ourselves with potential future scenarios, we're increasing the probability that when some series of events unfolds before us, if it pertains in any way to what we've practiced, we put ourselves in a better position to use the act of conversation to help us. We're trying to come off as smooth and as authentic as we possibly can, and preparing to speak publicly with the intention of creating something harmonious rather than memorizing something helps us accomplish this. And in closing, I'll just say this much. I want you to be successful. I want you to actualize your full potential and reach your goals. Having good public speaking skills is almost always a necessary skill. And by explaining the dangers of preparing, my goal is to increase the probability that you're able to optimize the time you spend preparing. Okay, that's everything I've got. Before I go, I just want to thank you, my wonderful viewer, for sticking with me to the end. I also want to thank my video editors, Bach and Joe. I couldn't do this without you guys. I appreciate you. And again, I'll thank you one more time, my lovely viewer. If you found this video interesting or useful or helpful, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and let me know what you think in the comment section down below. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you next time.